title of my talk today is called Half Gods, Good Surgeons May Be Called. It's a line from a poem that I'd like to read a little bit from for you, just to start off. O blessed science under sun, that most men's lives doth save, the art that greatest praise hath won, whereby great help we have, is surgery. For knowledge there in highest grace doth shine. The skill is honored everywhere for special griefs divine. Half gods, good surgeons may be called, and much more than men they be, and ought, like doctors, be installed in seats of high degree. What doth preserve the lives of men may claim due honor right, and should be praised with tongue and pen as far as day gives light. This poetic extract was penned by ballad writer and poet Thomas Churchyard to preface Peter Lowe's treatise, The Whole Course of Surgery, that was published in 1597. At first glance, the poem is merely laudatory, an appropriately flattering opening to a weighty surgical treatise. On second reading, it becomes evident that Churchyard never explicitly states what surgeons do to warrant praise. The scope of surgical practice is only described as those special griefs divine. Moreover, while the poet thinks that surgery and its practitioners deserve praise, this was evidently not the popular belief. Surgery should be given its due honor for saving men's lives. Surgical practitioners should be raised to lofty heights and awarded noteworthy appointments. They should be lauded just as physicians were lauded. Churchyard, in writing this poem, and Lowe, in using it to preface his treatise, sought to highlight what they saw as an unbalanced distribution of occupational and social credit based on an inaccurate, maybe inaccurate, perception of surgery and its practitioners. This inaccurate conception, to which Lowe especially objected, was propagated by the Royal College of Physicians, London, and it's still present throughout the historiography of early modern medicine today. It forwards the idea of a tripartite hierarchy of medical practitioners made up of physicians, surgeons, and apothecaries. The physicians, these very few men who were in possession of a medical degree and membership in the college, were ensconced firmly at the top of the hierarchy. Physicians, by virtue of their learning, were morally upright characters. They were Latinate. They had a sound grasp of the ancient medical theories on which they based their diagnoses and their treatments. This expertise meant that almost anything and everything came under the scope of their practice. The physician's domain was the human body and all it encompassed. They could practice internal medicine, for instance, treating a patient with therapies that are taken orally, and also external medicine, suggesting bombs and the like. Some of them even practiced surgical operations. In the natural order of things, the physician's duty was to supervise medicine as a whole and ensure the good practice of their subordinates. Physicians were professional, they were elite, and perhaps most important, they were gentlemen. Surgeons are next in this pyramid of power. They were unschooled, frequently called unlearned. Rather than a theory-laden university education, surgeons were products of the apprenticeship system. As guild members, they underwent a 7-year apprenticeship program with a master who would train them in the manual aspects of their field. Medical theory, often combined with the more practical things like dissections, for instance, was taught in the guild hall itself. Specially appointed physicians would read aloud their lectures or extracts from Galenic and Hippocratic writings. Surgeons were not Latinate. They were not university educated, and they were not gentlemen. In fact, the very physical and manual style of their practice made surgeons tradesmen. Accordingly, the scope of surgical practice was limited to external medicines only, and surgeons' actions were dictated by the diagnoses of the supervising, learned physician. Apothecaries are next in this hierarchical ladder here. They're a few rungs lower than the surgeons. Like surgeons, they're unlearned, in the sense of not having Latin or a university degree. They too went through an apprenticeship system, and their domain was limited to formulating and selling the medicines prescribed by physicians and surgeons. Apothecaries were, in fact, little more than grocers in some people's eyes. In terms of social standing, the apothecary could not hope to compare. They were vulgar, they were just mere retailers. Barbers, they're rarely included in this hierarchy. Though surgeons and barbers shared a guild, Henrician legislation forbade barbers from practicing as surgeons and forbade surgeons from practicing as barbers. They couldn't, for example, cut or shave hair. Barbers, however, were allowed to pull teeth because this activity was a little too straightforward for the surgeon to do. Now, this is the popular narrative, and I would like to say that it has more than just a few kernels of truth. It is not completely accurate. It's problematic in that neither the hierarchy that's laid out, nor even the professional boundaries that are espoused, existed in this idealized form. The Royal College's ability to enforce regulations was limited. Geographically bound to London and 7-mile radius around it, procedurally bound because conflicting legislation made them share power with the church. The college's bark was far, far fiercer than its bite. Quite simply, the formal, thoroughly regulated medical system described above was an idealized myth. Professional boundaries revolving around scope of practice were oftentimes negligible. Moreover, most practitioners in early modern England possessed authorization to practice from neither church, state, nor occupational organization. The medical field was in a state of flux for the 300 years typically considered early modern. Definitions, boundaries, the nature of the body, and disease were consistently negotiated, renegotiated, and redefined in the period. So, if this previously described picture is inaccurate, then who were these early modern surgeons and what did they do? Well, some scholarly work has been done on the surgeons belonging to the Barber Surgeons Company. We know little, however, about those who were unaffiliated with either the Guild or the Royal College. There were a wide variety of medical practitioners who practiced surgery, but yet cannot be labeled surgeon. For this reason, I've adopted the term surgical practitioner. It's just these tiny little lines that we need to cross in our theses here. And surgical practitioner I use to refer to these men and women who made their living in large portion using the surgical arts. So this includes members of the Royal College of Physicians, who were also licensed to practice surgery, barber surgeons, and a wide variety of unlicensed practitioners. Many of these men and women identified their occupational status as surgeon. A fair number actually accepted the unearned title of doctor, and even the social status of gentleman in some cases. Notwithstanding the risks of early modern surgery, simple surgical procedures made up a large percentage of in-person patient-practitioner interactions during the 17th century. Indeed, surgical practitioners provided the bulk of day-to-day medical care. That is not to say, however, that the early modern English were particularly prone to wounds that required stitching. The surgeon's scope was far wider and his duties far more complex than incision, extirpation, and suturing. Surgical treatises and casebooks record treatments for everything from cancers to scrofula, venereal diseases, and even mental illnesses. And in so treating, practitioners used a variety of internal and external remedies. Patient care extended well beyond the operation table, or chair as it may be. One of the most famous illustrations of this case, one of the most famous illustrations of this is the case of the famed diarist Samuel Pepys. And I love telling Pepys stories, they're wonderful. My students know they hear them all the time. So now we're going to talk about Pepys and his kidney stones, possibly bladder stones, not sure. So kidney stones and bladder stones actually tormented Pepys for years. Despite suffering almost constant pain from the time he was 20, he resisted surgical treatment for 5 years before agreeing to be cut for the stone by Thomas Hollier on 26 March, 1658. Pepys's worries about surgery were not unfounded. Lithotomy was a frequently performed, but sometimes deadly operation in the early modern era. There were a multitude of potential complications. Without anesthetic, the patient could go into shock, an unskilled surgeon could damage surrounding tissue and organs, and unsterilized instruments or surroundings could lead to infection and even sepsis. It was no wonder that Pepys was impressed by Hollier's statement that his last 40 lithotomy patients survived. Just as a note, the next 4 after Pepys died. So Pepys is lucky. In preparation for the surgery, Hollier bled and purged Pepys over several days, later placing warm compresses on the area of incision. On the day of the surgery itself, now I want you all to picture this and be a little bit grossed out. So on the day of the surgery itself, he was made to lie down. He was bound. His hands were tied to his knees, so his buttocks were in the air a bit there. And a probe, which I'm going to show you, is here. Let's take one of these. Actually, yeah, the biggest one is probably effective here. So this is a probe. And what happens is this probe is inserted through the urethra and into the bladder and to anchor the stone. Then we have a gorget, or gorget, this thing. So this is like this. And this thing is used to make an incision. In Pepys's case, it was a 3-inch incision just at the side of the perineum. So you lift the scrotum, 3-inch incision right into the perineum. And then with my third hand, because all of this is still in there, well, we can remove the gorget, the cut's made. But what happens is you get your forceps come into that incision, and you basically try to wiggle that stone out from there. So it's a really messy, painful, not pleasant process. In Pepys's case, he was incredibly proud to note that his kidney stone, or bladder stone, as it were, was described as the size of a tennis ball. We're not talking modern tennis balls here. Real tennis, or royal tennis as it was called, those tennis balls were only about 2 inches in diameter, but as you can imagine, 2 inches is still a very large thing to pull out of your body. So once that's extracted, Pepys's surgical procedure did not actually end at suturing. In fact, the wound was not stitched at all. So rather, it was washed and dressed with this mixture of vinegar and egg yolks and various oils, and then left to heal by scar formation. So after enduring this very invasive, painful operation, he was then subjected to further bleeding and purging and more topical and oral medicines. Pepys was so pleased by the result of this that he created a display case for the stone. And he would bring it out at dinner parties. This wonderful dinner party trick that I would have loved to see. He actually celebrated the anniversary of the operation every year until his death. He absolutely loved Hollier, his surgeon. He continued to employ him throughout his life to treat both himself and his wife. It would be fair, I would say, that Hollier became something of a family physician to the Pepys family, even though he was a surgeon. So, though ultimately successful, Pepys's surgery experience sounds kind of horrific. He had little anesthesia to prevent him from thrashing around, his hands were bound to his knees, and he's held in place by 4 young men who are described as strong, stalwart individuals. The actual operation took place at his aunt's home, and the surgical instruments, these lovely shiny things here, and the surroundings were certainly not sterilized. They were probably quite dirty. The lack of stitches left the incision open for infection, and that meant it didn't fully heal for months. In fact, it reopened a few years before his death. Moreover, it seems likely that inaccurate cutting on Hollier's part actually left Pepys possibly sterile. He and his wife Elizabeth tried very unsuccessfully to conceive for years. So, after that lovely story, I'd like to reiterate that this was an overwhelmingly successful operation. Despite a plethora of risks, the patient survived. So, kidney stones ran in the Pepys family. His mother and his brother John actually suffered as well. But, like I said, from the age of 20, his symptoms were severe. He was in constant pain, which increased in colder weather. He was occasionally bedridden, unable to urinate while standing up, and worryingly, he frequently noted bloody urine. At 22, he married the 14-year-old Elizabeth, who, despite her sincere attempts, was unable to nurse him back to health. A further 3 years passed after their marriage before Pepys made the decision to pursue surgical intervention. Given the sheer amount of time and the physical suffering he endured, it's safe to say that Pepys did not make this decision lightly. So what prompted him to seek a surgeon and consent to this potentially deadly operation? Was it just pure desperation? How and why did he ultimately choose Thomas Hollier? These questions, in various incarnations, they've been following me around for more years than I'd like to admit to you guys. When I started my initial exploration of this topic, I was very disheartened to find that most scholars, and the historiography of surgery for the most part, all said the same thing. There are too few sources to answer these questions, and the 17th century really wasn't all that important anyway, so there were no technological or technique-based innovations, so it really isn't worth studying. I disagreed and said, okay, well, let's think about this another way. Why would you go to a modern surgeon today? When I think of a modern surgeon, there are certain images that come to mind. And they're comforting images of that. Think of medical degrees, for one. I think of scrubs and white lab coats. I think of shiny and clean stainless steel instruments. And less materially, I think of a shared knowledge base. I think of membership in a regulatory professional organization and a certain cachet or authoritative presence. So with those ideas in mind, I ventured into the archives and started combing my way through. The Barber Surgeons Company records, surgical treatises, manuscript case books, lecture notes, correspondence, ballads, novels, everything I could get my hand on that mentioned surgeons and surgery. Yeah. So, first thing I thought was, what did I get myself into? And then second, I started compiling it all, and what I found was that those comforting indicators that I mentioned earlier, I think those comforting indicators of professionalism actually had their roots in the 17th century, as both individual practitioners and the guild actively sought further occupational and social credit. In so doing, these surgeons actually went the obvious route. They tried to make themselves more like physicians. They adopted and adapted certain strategies to present themselves as both competent and trustworthy. And in so doing, they gained not only more patients, but they helped to form a more recognizable occupational identity of surgeon. What I would like to do, though, is I would like to emphasize that this is not a linear teleological tale. The professionalization process was extraordinarily complex, it was piecemeal, sometimes it was accidental, and sometimes the strategies employed were rather unsuccessful. Surgery's growth in the period was also facilitated by a few key 17th century developments that we cannot discount. We have a changing religious atmosphere, especially the growth of sectarian Protestantism in England. Ubiquitous warfare, it's a big one, the scientific revolution, and then the explosion of print culture as well. So for the rest of our time together, I'd like to address two of the ways in which surgeons adapted and adopted physicians' methods. I might have to power through these because I kept wanting to pack more and more in there. So this is my thesis, minus 3 or 4 chapters condensed. So this might be a bit quick. So first, in order to gain occupational credit, surgeons sought to regulate educational attainment, to adopt the physician's learned language when treating patients, and to publish treatises and employ in these treatises case studies in the same way that physicians did. Second, in order to gain social cachet, conduct was policed, and surgeons tried to eke out a place among those of quality. They tried to mimic gentlemanly behaviors and rituals, once again, in the same way physicians did. So many of us in this room are are educators. We know that learning is not limited to the classroom. The Barber Surgeons Company, too, acknowledged that fact. Rather than challenge the physicians through the university system, they worked to get education more rigorous within the guild system. At the most basic level, they sought to prosecute those who practiced surgery without having first served their 7-year apprenticeship under a master. Moreover, the master-apprentice relationship was monitored, and limits were placed on the number of apprentices a master could have at any one time. Over the course of the 7 years, the master was to instruct the apprentice in the practical, manual aspects of the surgical art. The company court records show that sometimes this relationship broke down. When it did, apprentices and masters could go to the guild to have their case adjudicated. The guild took seriously these cases, where apprentices complained that their masters were not treating them well, were not feeding them enough, clothing them properly, or not teaching them enough. They were assigned new masters, and the old ones were fined or arrested. Upon completion of these 7 years, the apprentice booked his exam and was questioned by a committee of four men. And this sounds really familiar to the PhDs in this room, doesn't it? These examinations were really rigorous, and completing your apprenticeship did not necessarily mean that you would actually pass. One record, for instance, states that Robert Swain was this day examined and not found sufficient, but is nevertheless tolerated to come to lectures in anatomies and is to pay for the same 20 shillings yearly till he's found to be more sufficient. Continuing education also was very important, and lecture attendance was mandatory, even for masters in the field. In a move I wish I could emulate, actually, the Barber Surgeons Company ensured that lecture attendance stayed high by fining members who skipped without reasonable cause. These fines ranged from 2 to 10 shillings, depending on severity. If you were particularly prone to skipping lectures, the penalty could of course be much, much harsher. Roger Buckley, for instance, was actually discharged from office that he held in the company. He was banned from practicing surgery and then fined an additional 40 shillings. The guild, in this time period, was really spurred into action for the advancement of surgery, and in the mid-1600s employed Inigo Jones, the very famous architect, to erect a new anatomy theater for them, for larger lectures, and then as well a number of rooms for the smaller private dissections. So while these actions had the practical implication of increasing anatomical and surgical knowledge, they merely reinforced the differences between the learned physicians and the more manual surgeons. So in order to counter this, the guild and individual practitioners sought to present themselves as learned. This term is rife with meaning when used to describe medical practitioners, and in fact was most often used when referring to physicians. The term was used to designate the university-trained physician who was well-versed in ancient medical texts and able to apply the theories to their medical practice. In an effort to gain professional credit, surgical practitioners sought to increase their knowledge of this language of learnedness. That is, to have both an understanding of the theories and the ability to verbalize them as needed in either Greek or Latin. Now, in terms of patient-practitioner interaction, this backfired spectacularly. Medical jargon became a huge issue of contention between the practitioner and the patient because it could be used by the honest surgeon, and it could be used as a method of appearing more learned to deceive the unwary patient. This tension became something of a trope in the fictive literature at the time. In one example, the unfortunately named character, a surgeon named Pock, an obvious play on pox, is really quite well known for his use of jargon. In examining a head wound, he states, "The incision is not deep, nor the orifice exorbitant. The pericranium is not dislocated. I warrant his life for 40 crowns without the perishing of any joint." Pock's audience and his patient requested further information, which was given with further jargon. Interestingly, though, the surgeon's vocabulary, though exaggerated, his statements actually ring true. That is, he describes the wound and the method of treatment using the vocabulary one may actually find in a surgical treatise, without the grandiloquence designed to mislead found in later works of fiction. Perhaps one of the finest examples of the tensions caused by jargon can be found in Thomas Middleton and William Rowley's novel A Frank Quarrel. In it, a surgeon seeks to explain his prognostication to his patient's sister. The patient, known only as Colonel, was wounded in a duel and thought to be on his deathbed. So here's a bit of the text. Sister says, Come hither, honest surgeon, and deal faithfully with the distressed virgin. What hope is there? The surgeon says, Cavavina, I care but little for his wound in the esophag. Not thus much, trust me, but when they come to the diaphragm at once, the small intestines or the spinal medulla, then I straight fare syncops. The flanks retiring towards the back, the urine bloody, the excrements purulent, and the dollar pricking and pungent. And the sister says, alas, I'm near the better for this explanation, for this answer. The surgeon's explanations are bizarre in the extreme, and the hapless sister is forced to listen as he expounds further on ingredients that he's using in his quadrangular plumation, and his dressings of mastic and calafina and apopanax and sacrocoa. It just goes on. Hawkes' explanation, though littered with vocabulary unfamiliar to most audiences, is only sound. In contrast, the surgeon's dialogue is meant to be completely incomprehensible to both the sister and the play's audience. Indeed, when the sister finally requests a simple explanation, the surgeon tellingly replies, Mary, in plain terms, I know not what to say. It's likely that the authors of this novel sought to highlight the capacity for absurdity and the possibility that jargon could be used by practitioners to confuse and confound the unwary. And this is where the surgeon's representation differs a bit from the contemporary fictional physicians. In spite of the surgeon's speech, neither his professional legitimacy nor his skill is ever called into question. Rather, it's only his theorizing and his use of the learned language that seems questionable. When later describing how he cured the colonel, the surgeon states simply, I closed the lips on it, that is the wound, with bandages and sutures, which is a kind of conjunction of the parts separated against the course of nature. So when discussing matters of surgery, matters within his expertise, the surgeon's speech is actually perfectly sensible. I'm going to skip forward a little bit here. A couple of pages. So when surgeons are actually using more practical, adopting more practical strategies from these physicians, the fictive literature actually looks upon them rather favorably. And this is including things like dissections and prognostication. So skipping forward. So while mimicking the verbal communication style kind of failed, when surgical practitioners used the textual style of physicians, they seem to have been a little bit more successful. Vernacular surgical treatises proliferated in the 17th century, and these were authored by a wide range of surgical practitioners, from the mountebank to the university trained. Like physicians, surgeons sought to use the treatises, and more specifically, the inclusion of case studies, to do two things. First, to censure those who, through bad practice, brought surgery a negative reputation, and second, to help form a more coherent body of knowledge and encourage best practice. So, my example of negative reputation idea here is from Daniel Turner's Apologia Chirurgica. And this text is just filled with negative examples of failed treatments. And what Turner does is he methodically derides and he denounces those who he calls pretenders to surgery. He calls them the empirical practitioners, the quacks, the pamphleteers, the barbers, the pretending bone setters, and the doctress. He lambastes them in turn and provides lots of gory details that I won't go into, the patient deaths. In effect, he's questioning these practitioners and saying that they're actually committing forms of malpractice. They're ignorant, and they don't know how to treat these illnesses. They're misrepresenting their abilities to cure and their knowledge and experience. In effect, what he does is he's discussing all of these things that the Barber Surgeons Company during this period is actually seeking to regulate. So not all treatises were all that forceful, and we have a number of authors who presented case studies in order to form a more coherent body of knowledge and educate younger practitioners, and in so doing, encourage best practice. In this instance, we have, for example, Richard Wiseman, the famous Civil War surgeon. He very modestly began his treatise by stating that in 30 or 40 years of practice and the plentiful exercise of my profession, where I have been an eyewitness of the variety of methods in surgery, I think it is no great vanity for me by this time to pretend something of experience in the faculty. Once saying that he was so experienced and so knowledgeable, he goes on to talk about the difficulties that young surgeons face, and then lists a number of case studies, both his own and other practitioners, in order to help correct the gross errors that he saw in practice. He's very critical of these surgeons that are only writing about the theoretical aspects of surgery in their treatises. He says that concrete experience is a better teacher. And in this instance, which I'm not going to go to in much depth, what I see happening here is not practitioners publishing case information specifically to gain patients or encourage ameliorative action, as Thomas Lacour puts it. But I think these practitioners are very carefully selecting cases out of a wide variety of texts, both ancient and modern, in order to encourage best practice. Many years ago, I went out on a limb and called this the roots of evidence-based medicine for you medical practitioners in the room. So now it's the ways in which surgeons sought social credit, and I will power through this very quickly. As I previously stated, the learned physician was a gentleman by both breeding, education, and status. He would have had to originate from a generally wealthy background to afford the roughly £1,000 necessary to pay for the education that would set him apart as an elite practitioner. And 17th century surgeons sought to recast themselves as gentlemen, like physicians, rather than tradesmen. They did so by participating in networks of friendship and reciprocal relationships of patron-client, both informally, as part of the Republic of Letters, and as part of institutions such as the Royal Society. These correspondence networks actually provided wider arenas for intellectual inquiry. In this, I follow Mario Biaggioli and his work called Galilei Portier, and I see that the social and professional advancement are actually really quite linked. They go hand in hand. One of the motives underlying the search for social credit is actually an attempt to gain epistemological legitimacy as well. In the words of Tevye from Fiddler on the Roof, when you're rich, they think you really know. So one of the modes that surgeons use to recast themselves is to use epistolary mendacity, fancy term for letters of patronage. So surgeons actually acted as clients to wealthy, well-connected patrons. One example is Pepys, our friend from before. Another example is Sir Hans Sloane, the very eminent physician whose works, as my students well know, laid the foundation for the British Museum, British Library, etc. So what these surgeons did was, at the very, very base level, they provided gifts to these patrons in return for favors. But they also did things like information transmission. They delivered books, they delivered exotic curiosities, and they were also intermediaries. And by serving as intermediaries, they're being expedient. They're not only serving a purely functional service by acting as an intermediary between two patrons, they're also serving as brokers. And by serving as brokers, they're serving as buffers, allowing clients to take less responsibility when requests for favors ended in failure, for instance, or they were denied. So in return, the intermediary gained social credit, a larger network of contacts, and some familiarity with those of higher status. One example of this is the ship surgeon, later turned physician Alexander Stewart. He corresponded with Sir Hans Sloane for almost 40 years, and their relationship was a very close one. While still a surgeon, and despite enjoying a decade-long relationship with Sloane, Stewart made use of an intermediary asking Sloane for a favor, and apologizing very, 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 very sincerely for not having anything worthy of being sent or wrought of. Having entered into a patron-client relationship with Sloane, he was obliged to repay Sloane for his favors, and he sought to do so with curiosities later on. So Stewart's case is an interesting one because he has this very shallow relationship at first, but then he keeps building it up. he goes from just presenting curiosities to acting as an intermediary between Hans Sloane and Antony van Leeuwenhoek and various other members of the Royal Society in London. In keeping with expectations of politeness and civility, Leeuwenhoek and Stewart actually met and had a lovely time with Leeuwenhoek's his microscopes. And later, Stewart, writes back to Sloane about this, and they talk about in depth about these letters and these wonderful things that Leeuwenhoek is actually discovering in water, for instance. So, as that continues and that this relationship between Stewart and Sloane grows, we see that Stewart ends up taking up the mantle of ambassador to Sloane in some instances. He ends up going to medical school and graduating with an MD based on Sloane's recommendation. Sloane got him into this university. Later on, within 3 years of his graduation, he's elected as a member of the Royal Society. Later on, in the early 18th century, he's named physician in ordinary to Queen Caroline. He helped found St. George's Hospital and was awarded for his physiological research. Not bad for a ship surgeon, really, just working his way up through the patronage system. So we see that Stewart's use of the patronage system comes close to the idea of self-fashioning that Biaggioli describes for Galileo, and I encourage you all to read that book. It's fantastic. So these surgical practitioners that I've discussed here, they've all tried to adapt adapt these physicians' ideas and adapt these physicians' techniques in order to improve themselves in some way. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. In this particular instance, it worked beautifully. And the social cachet aspect, actually, I find far more interesting than the professional one. Don't tell my supervisor. In so doing, with all of these actions that we see these surgeons doing in the 17th century, they're blurring the lines between these Oxbridge-trained physicians with their theoretical subtleties and the surgeon empiric, as they were called. Through them, social and professional advancement of the less distinguished medical providers was fostered and encouraged. Interestingly, efforts to gain both professional and social credit were frequently met with disdain by physicians and the general public, so we have to be very careful about this linear idea here. It wasn't until 1745 that the physicians split from the barbers to become the Company of Surgeons, only gaining royal charter and becoming the Royal College of Surgeons in 1800. Ironically, at this time, at the behest of the Royal College of Physicians, surgeons were now required to go to medical school, finally gaining legitimate access to this learned language, the title of physician, the title of doctor. Perversely, and in a tradition that continues today, surgeons then eschewed the title of doctor in the UK and assumed the title of Mr., the one they tried so hard to avoid before. As the surgeon James Mortimer in The Hound of Baskerville insists, he is merely a Mr., so Mr., humble MRCS, not a doctor. Thank you.